no longer do we believe collectively that the only way or the best way is the big five. And I think they've lost a little bit of public confidence also because of how they do business. Everyone knows that they're not investing in publicity, that no one is editing books anymore. Authors feel much more on their own. And I think if authors are like, well, I'm already on my own, so why should I do it this way? I think people are thinking more critically. Hello, I'm Brooke Warner. I am the author of Write On Sisters. I am the publisher of She Writes Press. I have a podcast called Memoir Nation, and I have been in the book publishing industry for 25 years.
When did you first identify as a writer?
Probably when I wrote my first book, which was What's Your Book? And I did that when I left traditional publishing and started She Writes Press, in part because I wanted to see what it felt like to be an author. And What's Your Book was also the very first book ever published on She Writes Press. And I'm very glad I did it because I made some mistakes and spared my future authors from those mistakes. And but I do feel like becoming an author made me feel like a writer.
What year did you make that change?
2012.
Okay. Excited to dig in more when we get into it. What's your all-time favorite book?
Oh, gosh. All time, probably Sula by Toni Morrison, because I read it at a very critical age. I was 18 years old. It was a freshman intro to feminist writing class. And it really did change my idea of what writing even could be and helped me to understand what it meant, like what literary fiction meant. So
nice. What's your dream writing routine?
Dream writing routine would be a cabin or some sort of small place with a view. It could be the woods or the ocean with no one around, doors closed, my own time, and waking up in the morning, having coffee, getting to work, and then taking, a break in the afternoon and coming back later. So like 2 sessions, isolated, all of my favorite foods.
Nice. What's your real writing routine?
Oh my God, much more chaotic than that. Real writing routine is I have 2 hours. I'm on a crazy tight deadline. I'm trying to squeeze out anywhere from, 500 to 1,000 words. Mostly my Substack these days, tortured situation going on with my memoir. So the real writing routine does not look idyllic.
What's one piece of writing that makes you jealous you didn't write it?
Oh, that's a really challenging question for a person who's in the publishing industry, because I don't actually feel jealous of writers. I am admiring, but I aspire to publish great books. And so if I see great writing, I'm just like, wow.
Give me just one piece of writing that you admire if you're not jealous, which I think is great. Good not to be jealous.
Piece of writing. I mean, lately, definitely Maggie Smith. If I have any tinges of I wish I could do that, I think Maggie Smith would be it, because I admire not only her writing, but also her experimentation with form.
Amazing. I'm really excited to talk to you about publishing, about hybrid publishing. So give us the Cliff's Notes. What were you doing in publishing? And then what inspired She Writes? Give us the Cliff's Notes of that trajectory.
I got into publishing in 2000. I started in a small Berkeley press, and I was there for almost 5 years. And then I jumped to Seal Press, which was really a foundational formative experience for me, because Seal Press is a women-only press, nonfiction only. And I was there for 9 years, and it formed a lot of my sensibilities and how I think about publishing. And I left Seal largely because of the changes in the industry that were so frustrating to me, that were about prioritizing marketing over editorial. And I tell that story in my TEDx talk. So people can listen to that 18-minute journey. But it was hard because Seal was not only a dream job for me, but a lot of people said, you're crazy to leave. Like, this is sort of the apex. This is what everybody dreams of. But I had also been there 9 years and I was excited to do something new. And I started She Writes Press. And in a lot of ways, it was inspired by Seal because it's a women-only press. Of course, I didn't have the deep pockets to start a traditional publishing company. And so I started a hybrid press. And I didn't even know that it was hybrid when we first started. I was just like, oh, we're going to, do this thing. And it was my authors who helped me to come up with the language around what we were even doing at the time in 2012. And now, nearly 14 years later, She Writes Press has published upwards of 1,300 books, and we're solid. Things are good. And I am about to celebrate 25 years in the publishing industry, 13 in traditional, and almost 13 in non-traditional.
Amazing. Yeah. Siri Botten was talking about you got her anthology. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So how did you figure out, if you didn't really know that this like business model existed? How did you discover it?
Oh, that's a great question. So it did exist because when I was at North Atlantic Books, which was my very first job, we did hybrid contracts, but they were called co-publishing. And so I had a familiarity with non-traditional publishing contracts. And basically this publisher that I worked for had 3 levels of contracts. One was distribution only, one was co-publishing, and one was traditional publishing. So I was 23 years old when I got that job, and I didn't even understand that there were other publishers who didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And so when I got to Seal and I said, oh, we do co-publishing arrangements and distribution arrangements at North Atlantic, everyone was like, that's not even a thing. like, I don't know. We don't know what you're talking about. We're traditional and this is, this lane. And then I had that experience of understanding that that was a very legitimate way to publish, because we had authors at North Atlantic who opted into that because they were going to make more money.
Oh, really?
Oh, for sure. Yes. And I could talk about that because it's very interesting as a business model. So when I went to She Writes, I knew this template. I mean, when I started She Writes, I understood that authors not only would do it, but would prefer it from an entrepreneurial standpoint. And I also was in a place where I realized that places like Seal and many other traditional publishers couldn't publish really great books that deserved to be published because the authors didn't have the requisite author platform. So hybrid, like I said, I could have called it co-publishing. I don't know why we didn't, but the hybrid came as a term that people liked, and that was what stuck.
You said some people even prefer it. Let's drill down on that a little bit.
Yeah. So the probably most best example at North Atlantic Books is a very famous author named Peter Levine. And he wrote a book called Waking the Tiger. And he was what we called a distribution only author, and he has sold hundreds of thousands of copies of that book. And so basically, as a distribution only author, he was paying the majority of the expenses, so investing in his own work. And the return to him was 70% of his royalties. And so for someone like him who said, I have a giant following, I know that this book is going to be a huge success, I just want a distribution partner who can get my work out into the world in a meaningful way. And frankly, my former boss, the former publisher of North Atlantic Books, was very savvy because he said, okay, well, we can offer you that service and we'll keep 30% so that we cover our distribution costs. You'll make 70%. And Peter Levine is much, much, much wealthier for having gone that route than letting North Atlantic keep 92% of his profits. And so for the right author, and there are a lot of expenses, so I'm not saying this is like a lucrative route for every author, but that was in my mind as the best case scenario. And there are authors who, of course, recognize that, like Stephen King, who has negotiated completely different rights with his publisher and who makes much more royalties than the average author because he's sitting there saying, look, I'm bringing you guys such a readership over such a period of time. And so I think there are a lot of people who think that traditional publishing is broken for certain authors, depending on who you are, who your audience is, what your book is. So these kinds of non-traditional contracts exist. They exist in the publishing world, in the traditional publishing world. I think there's just much more of a openness to talking about them now than there used to be when I first started in publishing.
Totally. So you mentioned you learned some lessons from What's Your Book, putting that out in the world first. What were some of those lessons?
That I didn't know what made a good design. You know, I hired some designer who was, I don't even remember where I found her, but it looked good to me on the PDF file. And then I got the book printed and I opened the book and I was like, it was awful. Like the margins were bad. The type was bad.
Oh, no.
And I had this moment. It was a very good lesson for me though, which is, I know editorial. I don't know design. I can't be the person to sign off on files. I need to hire a design person and I need this and I need that. So, I had been very entrenched in editorial and that was my background. And of course, in book publishing, there's production and there's design and there's sales. And so it made me realize that in order to be a real company, I was going to have to hire some people and, have someone who was kind of my design backstop. And lucky for me, the person that did that for me is still with me. And, I have built a really good team and really thrived on the idea that I don't know what I don't know and needed to really bring in a team of experts.
And then you opened it up to other people and how did people get it right away? What was the response?
Yeah. I mean, that was the most amazing part because I had the kind of double legacy going on of Seal being a very, very popular imprint with I want to say kind of an incredible legacy. People love Seal Press and they're about to celebrate their 50th anniversary this coming year, actually. And then I had She Writes, so I had the very smart idea to partner with my friend, Kami Wyckoff, who had started SheWrites.com. And the She Writes was a thriving community at the time. And so when we started the press, we sort of had a built-in microphone to say to Seal people, to Seal fans, and to She Writes community members, like, we're starting this press and we're going to do this. And so in the very first season, including the season of my own book that had the problems, which thankfully, like I said, we were able to rectify for the other authors. We published 7 books, which is a lot. It's a lot for a brand new publisher. The fact that I had 6 other people who wanted to publish. And so there was almost an immediate response to it. I think people were excited that there was going to be this in-between thing. That they did not want to self-publish. They were decidedly not interested, and they were facing barriers in the traditional world. And we seemed to offer this middle ground. And that's a lot of how we talked about it in the early years, a third way. Like I said, hybrid emerged from my authors. They chose that term. And then other people started using the term hybrid. I mean, it was not a thing. I didn't look around and saw there was other hybrids. It really emerged out of, I think, a moment, like a zeitgeist. And people will say, they've been hybrid for 25 years, but that label was just not being used.
That's incredible. So how do you vet these projects? You're used to being a traditional editor. Are your filters kind of the same or have they evolved?
That's a great question. I mean, part of my frustration at Seal, like I mentioned, was the increasing pressure on authors to have an author platform, to already be known. That's a little bit different in fiction, of course, but we were only publishing nonfiction and Seal was a nonfiction press. So I didn't really understand the world of fiction until I started publishing fiction. That said, when we started She Writes, the idea was that it was going to be only about the writing, that you didn't have to have an author platform. The whole premise was we're going to evaluate the work based on the writing alone. And that is still the premise. You can publish on She Writes with no author platform because that's sort of the reason we exist. And so the evaluation has always been on the writing. And we are very clear, like if you are all telling, if there's no showing, if you're not in scene, if your craft is lacking, if your characters are flat, we give you that feedback. We do a double round of assessments, and then we publish those books that we think have strongest writing, and that's across genres. I can't remember why I chose to do fiction. I think it must have been Kami, my co-founder, because she was more in the world of fiction. It was a total new beast to me. I had never, ever edited fiction my entire 13 years in publishing, but Kami was a novelist and she published her novel with She Writes in the early days. And so over the years, I've, of course, feel more confident. I feel confident, of course, more than then to evaluate fiction. But these days we have assessors, that's a job category for us, people who assess the manuscripts, read them, evaluate them, give them feedback, sort of based on a loose rubric.
So you mentioned the platform piece of it. The industry has changed so much, and there is so much more onus, it seems like, on authors to really get out there and sell their books. So I know people can publish without a platform, but like to you, from watching books go out into the world and what succeeds, what do you feel like kind of is a minimum viable platform these days? Like how would you recommend authors start building that? What pieces are important?
The thing that I talk about a lot that is just true and has been true for 20 years is that there is a catch-22 in book publishing, which is that you actually need a book to build a platform, but publishing wants you to have a platform before they buy your book. And that is very complicated for the vast majority of authors. And so, of course, there are exceptions. And again, with fiction, it can be a little different because with fiction, it can rest solely on the writing. But even in fiction, traditional publishing prefers younger writers, prefers attractive writers, prefers, authors who are not having their first breakout novel in their 60s. Of course, there are exceptions, lessons in chemistry. Yes, I know, but it's not the norm. And so in nonfiction, where it's much easier to build a platform, it's very hard to get on podcasts, to get your work out into the world, to build your Substack if you don't have the book that really buoys you and gives you that kind of visibility. If someone comes on my podcast, they have to be an author. They have to be a published author. They can't be like, oh, I'm shopping my book around. And so the reality is that the published book opens doors. And so the minimum viable platform is, for us, literally nothing. But we say to authors, you got to build a website. You have to start a social media presence. You have to start building. And authors in my world do find that they're able to build their platforms with their books, because then the book is the leverage. In traditional publishing, you absolutely have to have a platform. Especially for nonfiction, they're just not going to take your work. So it just makes it a little bit more complex, but it also makes our business model more viable.
Okay, so the publicity piece, which is related, do you have in-house PR? Do your authors usually hire PR? I have my debut coming out in April, and I got a little sticker shock, but I was sort of warned that I might get quotes for like $30,000, and I did. And that's ultimately not what I decided to do. I got a great publicist, but at a better rate. So anyway, very familiar with that, but I would love to know what's happening with a lot of She Writes authors.
Yeah, well, and congratulations. It's exciting. The She Writes community, by and large, does hire publicists, and we have recommended publicists that we trust that do not work for us. And in fact, we don't even take a commission. It's just like, these are partners that we have worked with in capacities big and small since the outset. Because from the very beginning, I was like, yes, publicity matters. We are not going to do it in-house because it just doesn't make sense. And especially because there was always going to be some overlap in topics and because of the nature of the work that we're doing. So authors are all over the map, frankly. I mean, some do not hire publicists. Some definitely spend that $30,000. I would say most are in the $10,000 space, just because that tends to be a very viable campaign that is months long and a little more, manageable in terms of cost. But yeah, publicity is tough because I think it's very important to have a publicist if you want to break through the noise. And I'm very sensitive to my authors' budgets in the sense that I say, if you can't do it or if it's going to make you sick to do it, please don't spend the money on it. But then you have to temper your expectations, because our distribution partner is Simon and Schuster, and the sales reps do in fact need and expect the publicity hits. We send them on a regular basis, and so those books that get more publicity, they do rise to the top of the awareness, and there is a correlation with higher sales. There just is. And so with that reality in mind, authors need to decide what to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you find like new media versus old media, is it like a lot harder to tell these days? Like what is actually going to move the needle, or how do you see it play out usually?
I mean, I do think it's new media primarily because I think if we're talking about new media being, the proliferation of podcasts and Substack and TikTok in particular, probably being the one that for my authors who actually do it well, they're seeing the most translation to sales. Instagram is far below it in terms of what it moves. All of it is new. Old media is like television spots. I mean, people are going on TV, but it's not doing anything. People aren't even seeking out TV. They're seeking out YouTube spots, and, podcasts with really big listenerships are much more important to authors than any kind of, especially local TV. I mean, what are you even going to do with that? And then you have, of course, newspapers and magazines, which authors are still very excited about, especially local. I mean, I think that if you can get a local spot, like San Francisco Chronicle is my local paper, when my authors get in there, I am elated, and so are they. So there are things that are more maybe sentimental in terms of, are they actually moving sales? Forever, it's been difficult for publishers to completely correlate the placement of something with sales. You can see a little bump. Those bumps used to be a lot bigger. And I think right now it's all about the mosaic, of all the things that you're doing and then just trying to sustain so that you have relevance beyond the first month post publication, because these rises and falls, they're just so fast. They didn't used to drop off so quickly.
I would love to hear if you have like a case study or two of like, she writes books that were like big successes for you, and kind of like, what about them you think really made it successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've given it a lot of thought myself, like what made this book break out. On the fiction side, we have a book called The Truth About Horses. It's sold incredibly well. Like at this point, I want to say 40,000 copies, something like that. The author unquestionably is kind of an amazing marketing person. She really, really figured out Amazon ads. I think that working Amazon, we had thousands of sales through Amazon on that book. I think it being about horses helped. Mm-hmm. It was a good story. She's pretty well connected. So there was a lot of things that were working for her, but undoubtedly there was a lot of marketing and publicity, and she did put dollars into it. Then we have another author on the memoir side who has not invested as much money, who's been incredibly successful. And she's kind of been like this phenomenal, I want to say surprising because it's surprising to me, TikTok success, because she's like in her 60s.
I love that.
She's just a really, really good storyteller, and people love her. I mean, she tells stories from her, like apartment in New York City, and she's kind of quirky, and she posts these videos and they just go insane. And her book, her memoir is about her dogs. And I think that's perennial too. Interesting that like horses and dogs, there is something to be said that these are just topics that people are drawn to. But we've had a couple of really strong sellers in categories that traditional publishing doesn't like to touch, like abuse memoirs. And one in particular called Bright Eyes that really has performed well. The author did a TEDx talk. She has really focused in on how to heal from trauma, so instead of making it about being a survivor, it's been much more about the recovery and the sort of taking the reins in a sense. And I think that has appealed to people. So, and she's a dynamo. I mean, a lot of it is that the authors themselves are dynamic and they're not afraid to talk about their books and sell their books and be out there. Because there's a lot of authors who are more hand-wringy and almost apologetic about having written a book. And that is a kiss of death in a sense, because the more you can be out there generating conversations about it, the better.
Yeah. I would love to, especially since you have this like knowledge of traditional publishing from before. I just feel like, when I first started writing, you'd hear about self-published authors, and it was sort of like the kiss of death, like do not self-publish. Traditional publishing, they won't ever touch you. And now it's like they're scouting for success stories from self-publishing. So that's totally changed. I also, on a personal note, like when I finished the first full draft of Girl Gone Wild 5 years ago, I was like big 5 or bust. And then when it ultimately landed at a small press, I'm like so grateful, because ownership is more important to me than it was before. Control is more important. Creative control is more important to me than it was before. And so now I have like a totally different mindset, and like self-publishing does look attractive in some ways. And, co-authored books or hybrid fit in there too. So I would love to hear your perspective on that shift and like opportunities and challenges of where we are now.
Yeah. I mean, I started noticing self-published books being picked up even when I was at Seal. So it has always happened. It's always been the case that if you could be successful enough, because you're proving to the publisher that you're a good bet, that you are generating sales. And that's why, probably the most famous self-published book of all times is 50 Shades of Grey. Right. It's like that book just took off, and yes, it's erotica, but everyone's like, oh, it was so poorly written, but Random House was like, we'll take it, and the sales of that book literally generated bonuses for their entire staff for years. And so it's been happening. Like I said, there was a handful of books when I was at Seal Press that were getting scooped up, and they would make headlines, oh, this self-published book, that self-published book. So it's at least been happening for 20 years that this has been true. I think, what do I see as the difference? I mean, I think what's happening is that so many more people are publishing books, and no longer do we believe collectively that the only way or the best way is the big five. And I think they've lost a little bit of public confidence also because of how they do business. Everyone knows that they're not investing in publicity, that no one is editing books anymore. Authors feel much more on their own. And I think if authors are like, well, I'm already on my own, so why should I do it this way? I think people are thinking more critically. And also there's this whole giant new landscape of hybrid, and there's successful self-published authors who are doing amazing things and who are like, I would never give up my rights to, like, why, again, like Stephen King, why would I give my publisher 92% of my profits? even if they're paying for everything, the math doesn't make sense once you get into big volume.
Yeah.
So it's just a more entrepreneurial landscape, I think, is really what it comes down to.
Do you feel like the shift is like, I was talking to Jane Friedman and she was like, it's like the creator economification of publishing or whatever. So like, is it that? Is it just like the shift that's kind of happening everywhere that's tech driven? Do you feel like?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that statement. I think we all understand that we can do things ourselves and that we can partner with people and that we have more agency. So obviously, if I shop my book to Penguin Random House and they say, no, Brooke, we don't want to. It used to be the case that people were like, oh, well, my writing career is over. I'm putting this manuscript in a drawer and that's it. And now people are like, I don't really care, Random House. Like, I'm going to go ahead and publish my book and thanks anyway. And so I think it's the sort of like lessening power of the gatekeepers. You know, I think Substack is just a really interesting parallel to all of that. When you see people leaving the New York Times, leaving whatever journalistic careers they're having, and then having this giant success on this completely self-run experiment that is clearly making people a lot of money. And will it last forever? No, but it's just very interesting. And so I do think people are taking that creator force into their own hands. And they're also understanding that it's not just about the book. The book is one piece of a much larger puzzle that if you want to be someone noticed in the world, it's not just the book. It's the Substack, it's the podcast, it's the, YouTube videos. It is a creator economy. It's a content economy.
Yeah. I would like to drill down a little into Substack. You mentioned writing for your own Substack, and do you encourage your authors to get on there? I don't know. Was the email list such a big thing back in the day when people were trying to sell books?
Yeah, it was because, yeah, for sure. Because people who had email lists could convert sales, and never, ever has social media actually been a good place to sell books. People have huge followings on social media and they're not converting.
No.
And it just doesn't, and it never has. And so the email lists are true fans. Those are people who have been like, I would like to give you my email address and hear from you because I like you that much. And so the email list has always been this really important thing. And it's interesting because I use my email list to promote my stuff. And on Substack recently, I promoted some classes and I had like 20 people unsubscribe. And so what I think is fascinating is like, I think there's a real lack of tolerance on Substack for promotion. And so I'm just kind of watching that myself. People love it and it's a really important avenue, but I don't think it exists to promote stuff. And so I think that email lists are still actually quite important.
That's really interesting. I feel like once you get above a certain threshold of subscribers, there's like that natural churn anyway. So kind of like whatever you send, people will be like, oh, I don't want this. But not everyone, just like a few people each time where you're like, what?
Yeah. I mean, it's completely anecdotal and maybe it was just the thing, but I was like, oh, that's interesting. So watching those metrics does help me think about what is Substack in this content economy. I use my newsletter almost exclusively to promote because I promote classes and other things that I'm doing. So I think you just have to be a little savvy about what different vehicles you have to reach people and what their purpose is.
Okay. AI. Listen, there are some writers that are like, if it even comes close to me, I will murder someone. And then there are other writers who seem like they want to use it as a tool. I don't want it to touch my manuscript, but I definitely see use cases for like making a schedule for my writing class or optimizing a podcast title or things like that. I would love to get your perspective.
I probably land where you do. I wish it was never invented. The fact that it was means we have to live with it. And I also use it as a research tool. I'm one of these people who for sure is like, oh, I don't use Google anymore because chat is just much, much more effective.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so for those kinds of things and research and blah, 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 I never use it for my writing and I never will. It makes me recoil. I think the place that I have the most hatred for it is that I see it in our manuscript submissions. And
really?
Oh, for sure.
How can you tell?
I mean, in the very worst case scenarios, people do bad cut and pastes. And so there's literally a prompt that's happened twice. And I want to say that's extreme. And it was an immediate rejection because I was like, if you can't even realize that you cut and pasted a prompt from AI into the manuscript, I can't work with you. But we can tell, if you're a professional reader and you're seeing a lot of manuscripts, there's a certain cadence. It's like a glossiness. There's a sameness of sentence. It's hard to describe. I did write about it in one Substack, just trying to show people how we see it, but it's for sure there. And this is another example where I was working with a writer. I assessed her manuscript. I gave her a bunch of feedback, and 6 months later, she sent me a new manuscript. And I was like, it was so different, and so kind of perfect.
In not a good way.
It was much better than her previous version, but it was so obviously AI enhanced. And so it's just a challenge because there are some authors who are like, I wouldn't have a book if it weren't for AI. We're really struggling with it, just internally, how to deal with it, because we can't have a zero tolerance policy, or I think at this point we would honestly cut out like half of our submissions.
Really?
But we ask if the authors use AI in our submissions, and I would like to cut a very strong line at like no cutting and pasting, full passages. But this is just going to continue to be, I think, some kind of reckoning is not even the right word. I mean, it distresses me, and there's no going back. And I sort of long for before, but it's very in my space.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what do you think? Like, I can see with ghostwriting, like you record a bunch of interviews with someone and like maybe you put it in AI and you get a first draft. Mm-hmm. Like I can see it creeping into the industry like that, but you're saying it's going to creep in even more. It's going to creep into all kinds of writing.
It already has. I mean, that's the thing that it is. So like, it just was like a switch flipped is kind of how I feel, like it was not there and then it's there. And I feel like most authors right now are using AI in some kind of capacity for at least what we're talking about, research and stuff. And then I think there are a large number of writers who are like, oh, this is going to help me sound better. And I think also I noticed that the younger writers have far less qualms. They're perfectly happy to just be like, I use AI and it's great. And, and then older writers who either like would never confess it or who are just totally anti. And I tend to probably land in the more anti camp. I find it troubling. And I also think that, just like I don't want my son to use AI to do his homework, it's the same thing. You're not learning to be a better fill in the blank if you're using AI to make your writing sound better. He's not learning French when he looks up all the words on AI. So it's not different. It's the same complaint, and we should all be concerned.
Yeah, I could probably talk to you about that for another while. Okay. Is there anything else before we get into the final lightning round that you think about how the publishing landscape has changed since you've been in the business?
Yeah. I mean, it's radically different. When I got in 2000, it was still had, I would say, like 2 feet and one toe, 2 feet in the traditional world and one toe in the non-traditional. And now I think it's like solidly 1 foot in each. Traditional publishing is just not the end all be all for most authors. And if they get rejected, they might be disappointed. They might always long for a certain kind of experience, but writers are much more resilient. It's a mixed bag for sure, because there are a lot of challenges to so many books in the world, and authors still have the same high expectations they've always had, except with vastly more competition. And Amazon, who we haven't even talked about, is a nightmare, in a lot of ways, but yet indispensable. And so there's just a lot going on. And then the rise of audiobooks. It's a fascinating industry to be in. I think it's fast moving. And Michael Castleman, who is someone you might have on your podcast someday, he's awesome, is, a publishing industry expert. And I had him on my podcast and I asked him about publishing and he's like, it's a dog fight. And I just always think about that. I'm like, that's how I feel. I feel like I get up in the morning, I open my computer and it's a dog fight all day. And then I close and I was like, oh, and that's published.
That's so funny.
But somehow it's worth the fight. So,
okay. I just want to ask you one more question about, you're right. We didn't talk about Amazon, and I would love to get your like, what are the challenges, and yet why is it indispensable?
They're a monopoly, and bottom line, that's the challenge. They set terms that publishers can't dispute. They are our biggest customer, and they make it very, very difficult for authors to prioritize other retailers. So if I say to my authors, your book is coming out, let's really work on driving sales to indies or driving sales to other places. Everybody wants to drive sales to Amazon because of rankings and algorithms and reordering and reviews. And that is super problematic in terms of other pieces of the pie being attended to, because authors have this very strong incentive to just drive to Amazon. So it is frustrating. And if anything goes wrong at Amazon, you better believe there's going to be an email in my inbox immediately from authors, from, someone took the buy box, right? Because third parties take the buy box. I don't like my pricing, all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's just a nightmare for us. It's indispensable for the exact same reasons. They figured out how to make everybody buy, and not to mention shipping is free. It's so much cheaper than anywhere else you might go. And then you have to be a verified buyer to review the book, and everybody cares about reviews, and now they own Goodreads. It's a complete, like, you're imprisoned, because if you want to branch out and say, I'm going to break the mold here and not do Amazon, I don't have the courage to do it. I don't know how we would have a business. I don't think our authors would be interested in publishing with us if we were like, oh, we're doing something outside the box and we don't have Amazon. Like, everybody wants it. And so it's, It just is all those things. It's hard.
What's a buy box?
Buy box is when you look at the box where you purchase on Amazon and it will say available through Amazon and available through Prime. And what happens on Amazon for books and all products is that third-party vendors can take over the buy box. And when we, as a publisher, lose the buy box, it means Simon & Schuster has lost the buy box. It's a very competitive environment at Amazon vendors, because they're vying to be the vendor who gets the buy box, because people don't see it and they just then are getting more sales. And Amazon creates an environment where they're intentionally wanting their third-party vendors to compete. But when we, who have lots of stock, lose our buy box, it's so shitty.
Yeah.
Because we have inventory we're trying to move, but Joe Schmo in Seattle is selling our book and he got the buy box. And so we have to fight those fights and contact Simon & Schuster, say we lost the buy box, get them to contact Amazon. And I swear probably Simon & Schuster spends an inordinate amount of time dealing with this, and they shouldn't have to.
Oh my God. Okay. I could talk to you forever, but I'll wrap it up. So what is next for you? Any bucket list writing goals?
Well, I mentioned my tortured memoir, and it's only tortured because I have a goal to publish it after my son graduates from high school. And so it's got this trajectory, and I've got like 5-year radar kind of thing. But I work on it periodically, just not as much as I would like to or quote unquote should. My new thing that I'm really focused on is Memoir Nation. I started this community. It's an offshoot of my podcast, and it's just exciting to me because it's the genre of my heart. As I always say, I love memoir and I like elevating memoirists. In terms of goals, that's like a new project. And so the goal is just to keep it alive and viable. And She Writes is sort of my, I don't even want to, she's like my long-term partner, like we're in good shape and she'll always be there for me, but it's got its own churn.
Okay. One piece of writing advice you wish you could give your former self.
Gosh, I think these are hard questions because, I'm sure you're more used to interviewing like regular, real writers. And I'm not saying I'm not, but like I have been in the business of midwifing books and helping people to write books since I was 22 years old. And I think when I think about advice that I would give myself, it's almost impossible to even put myself in that place. It's like all of the best advice that comes to me is the advice that I give to other writers. It's like you have to make space for the thing that you want to do. You have to not compare yourself to other people. If you want to get published, fucking do it. Like that's the big one, right? Because people just get around like, oh my gosh, I'm getting rejected and I this and I that. And it's like, we live in this incredible new world where if you want to have a book, you can have a book. And I'd have to like really think hard if there is something I would say to my young self is just immersed in this world,
One tip for writers trying to get a book published, just fucking do it.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on what you want to do because some people will always have the traditional dream and they're not going to give that up for a good long while. And I respect that. If you want to get traditionally published, then you need to do what it takes to be, attractive to a traditional publisher. You can't be like, oh, I have a website from 1998 and, I'm not interested in doing any new content. Like, no, you have to be like, oh, okay, this is what it takes and build all of those things. So author education, if you want to get published, figure out what this industry is. There's a lot going on in the world of book publishing and people who are just like, oh, I just want to get a book published. That's not enough, and there's so much out there that is available for you to take advantage of, classes, talks, podcasts. And so I just don't really have tolerance for like that level of naivete, which is just like, I have a book and I'm going to get it published. No.
What's your all-time favorite piece of your own writing? It could be anything.
I'm probably most proud of my book, Right On Sisters. I mean, it's the most recent and it's the most personal and it's the most, it stemmed from all the things that I wanted to say about what I learned about women only publishing, being a woman in the publishing industry, being a woman author, all of which I still think is hugely important. Like, yes, there is still a lot of gendered shit going on out there. And, it stands. It's a good book and there are good stories in there. So
awesome. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your insights. And it's incredible what you're doing over at She Writes. How can listeners connect with you online?
I'm in so many places. So I encourage people to check out shewrites.com or shewritespress.com, excuse me. That would be important. She Writes Press, has links for submission and how to publish with us and all of that stuff. Memoir Nation. I mean, if you're a memoirist and you're curious what we're doing over there, awesome. And then of course, BrookeWarner.com is my personal site and I have a contact button and I'm very easy to find, in fact.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of The Bleeders. This one is a video episode, so you can listen to it on the podcast feed or you can watch it on YouTube. Just search The Bleeders Podcast. If you want to support the show and level up your own creative practice, check out my upcoming classes and workshops for writers and podcasters. I love helping writers uplevel their craft and their career. And of course, my debut memoir, Girl Gone Wild, drops April 1st. Please pre-order your copy. It really helps. Rate, review, like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, happy bleeding.